Before we go any further, I think it might be good to review the issues that always turned me away from 3D Sonic games in the past. Because while this game is far from free of these issues, I have to say that I think that a lot of the reason I like it so much is because it does more to mitigate these issues than any other 3D Sonic game that I've played at least. First of all, Sonic is all about speed of course, and speed in 3D is a dangerous combination. While it's obviously probably theoretically possible to marry these concepts, there are an enormous amount of tensions introduced by trying to do so that you just cannot ignore, as they negatively affect huge swaths of the game if they go unaddressed. Already, sometimes in 3D games, from a poor camera angle, depth perception can be difficult. It's frustrating to fall right through a platform you thought you were going to land on because you didn't realise you were a centimetre too far back to land on it. Most traditional 3D platformers address this pretty well by simply trying to make sure that the player's camera is always viewing the stage from an angle that makes it clear where they're going and where they're going to be landing after a jump, and giving the player a bit of extra time to look around to clear up any uncertainty. But then there's Sonic. Speed fights against both of these concepts. Moving fast forces the camera to run a marathon just to keep up with you, and often leads to it having a fit, desperately trying to get a clear view of the player while bonking into as much nearby level geometry on the way as possible, so the camera keeps jittering back and forth to avoid clipping into a wall. Speed just creates poor camera angles, which in turn causes awkward and frustrating platforming where depth perception becomes more difficult than it should be. You can try to remedy this by creating fixed camera angles that are designed specifically to avoid these issues, especially for sections of the level where poor camera angles are a common issue, and while this helps, it kind of also introduces its own issues. Fixed camera angles may make for better angles, but they also take away player freedom. Not only in that you can't move the camera yourself, but often from a fixed angle there's only really one direction that's practical to move in without needing to move the camera on your own to see more clearly. So it encourages linear gameplay, which doesn't really take advantage of what making a 3D game brings to the table. I think this is honestly sort of why a lot of the more awful Sonic games in recent memory have a huge issue with sections of gameplay which essentially just play themselves. Because first you fix the camera because this speedy section has a very poor camera angle otherwise, but then you realise, well, you can't see that well if Sonic tries to turn left or right with this fixed camera, so maybe you just make a huge stretch of the level a boring old straight line. And maybe it just starts out as one section of the level, but then you find another section that looks pretty awful with the camera angles you're getting, and it's like, maybe I'll fix the camera angle of this as well. Okay, I'll have to remove that turn then, I'll have to make this straight, I'll have to make this straight, and before you know it, you've got an extremely bland level, which is essentially just a Sonic Forces auto-scroller. The other issue is simply that by virtue of being so fast, the player's mind gets less time to process what they're looking at, and figure out how close or far away objects on the screen are. Beyond that, 3D environments are just more difficult to construct. Often a lot of time and attention to detail is invested into them, and as a result, most 3D platformers thrive off of slower paced exploration. Whereas Sonic games have you blast through these environments in the blink of an eye, and that means a lot of time and resources goes into just making a couple seconds of gameplay, and it makes it hard to make the game long enough to feel like a satisfying and complete experience. Another problem with 3D environments is that when mixed with speed, it makes it awkward to take advantage of the new angles you can now move at in 3D. Because most of the game you're running in a mostly straight line. You need to add more turning and looking around to take advantage of the exploration that 3D environments enable, but that would exacerbate the already existing camera issues with all the twisting and turning it'd have to do to allow the player to see just where they're going. It definitely feels like exploration and speed are basically always at odds in this game, and very rarely get to coexist. Lastly, as unfortunate as it is to admit, a heavy component of platforming games is waiting and timing things. I'm not saying it's ideal, far from it, but it's everywhere, even in your favourite 3D platforms. Waiting for a series of moving platforms to fall into the correct positions to be able to cross, waiting for an enemy who's only vulnerable once they miss an attack, or waiting for a trap to deactivate before running through a corridor before it reactivates. In some form or another, these are all staple mechanics of platformers that we all know all too well. Now have fun trying to mix waiting and speed. These mechanics that would be staples of any other Mario or Banjo-Kazooie game that no one would bat an eye at feel particularly awful in Sonic games because they often completely break the flow of a level. 1 second, you're shooting down the corridors of the Black Arms Black Comet in space on an infiltration mission at the speed of a fucking bullet train, wreaking havoc and mayhem upon all who cross your path. and the very next second you're reduced to a hard stop because you entered a section of the level where now you have to wait for slow-moving platforms, and now you have to play the waiting game and do slow, careful movement and platforming to progress. And damn, isn't that just a massive mood killer? As a result of all these issues, I've always personally been of the opinion that if there was some theoretical, mythical, mystical, good 3D Sonic game out there, don't get excited guys, it only exists in our minds, it would have to ditch the platforming, at least for the most part. It can still be based heavily around movement in a 3D space, but the challenge just shouldn't be built upon trying to get from point A to point B. That just is not really that fun with Sonic in my opinion. It should be built more upon exploration and/or, believe it or not, I always felt the Sonic games could actually seriously benefit from even a basic combat system. It does feel good to move around 3D spaces super fast, it just isn't very fun having to clear blind jumps and deal with your blistering pace being grinded to a halt to wait for moving platforms. So a good way to put this fun 3D movement to use is to use it as a tool for dodging and creating or closing space between an enemy that you're fighting, rather than a tool to get over a pit. Oh, and just to quickly throw it in there, I honestly have very blurry memories of Sonic Unleashed. I haven't played it that much. I know that has a combat system. I hear people say it's awful. I would assume that's because you're slow in Werehog form, but honestly, I can't really comment on it. Either way, having said all that, you might be beginning to see where I'm going with all this. Because if you think about it, didn't Shadow the Hedgehog kind of already do all these ideas that I'm proposing? Shadow the Hedgehog added bonus objectives to every level that allow you to take the hero route, dark route, or the neutral route for just making it to the exit instead. Those bonus objectives often more encourage exploration than anything else. And as for the combat, well, I mean, look at the box art. It is the Sonic game where the Hedgehog has a gun. If Shadow can use Joker from Persona 5's infamous neutral special in this game, you bet it's got a combat system. This doesn't instantly make Shadow the Hedgehog the 3D Sonic game of my dreams, of course. The combat is pretty shallow, though I still think that the lightning-fast movement does a lot to carry what otherwise would probably have been a truly mindless button masher into something that actually is genuinely quite a bit of fun. The exploration aspect is hindered a little by the subpar camera and often conflicts with your speed, and inevitably that does lead to most of the worst aspects of this game being moments where you're forced to retrace your steps and walk back through a level you already reached the exit of 1 hour ago just because you missed one enemy you need to kill to complete your objective. Only to later find that the enemy you've been missing the entire time is only barely visible for about 1/10 of a second during a speedy section where you blink and you miss it. Whoa, what was that? That was weird. I'm sure it was nothing. Moving on. Clearly, both of these sides of the game still have their own issues, and especially once you also remember that this game doesn't abandon the platforming ideas like I suggested, it becomes clear that the game is held back a little by the platforming meshing awfully with the speed and combat of the game. But all that being said, from there on out, I mostly have nothing but positives to say. Exploring levels is super fun, and it's just annoying when you get stuck on a level for an hour looking for one last enemy. Combat may be kinda shallow conceptually, but when combined with the far deeper movement mechanics of the game, it's certainly fun. And the game's boss battles especially, I find to be an absolute blast. Well, most of them at least. Hey, it's Shadow the Hedgehog. You know every diamond in the rough I find with this game comes with a gigantic asterisk attached to it by ball and chain at this point. But yeah, the egg dealer fight kind of sucks, mostly because of awful auto-lock mechanics with the homing attack being what you need to be able to hit this boss. But other than that, the rest of the bosses in the game are really fun in my opinion. The Black Bull's a bit of a pushover, but he's also the first boss you could possibly fight, so that kind of makes sense. He's supposed to be like an early starter boss. And I mean, he is satisfying to beat, just a bit basic. The Egg Breaker, while simple and reused in 3 different levels, is still one of the better fights in the game, and at least every time they reuse him, they give him a different arena with different attacks, so it actually feels like a different boss fight. The arena actually matters too, because to be able to homing attack him, you need a height boost, so if you're on an arena that's flat ground, you can't homing attack him. I feel like this fight does the most to exemplify why the combat of Shadow the Hedgehog is fun despite how simple and basic the weapons are. Because yes, while shooting the Egg Breaker is just mashing the shoot button, actually dodging its attacks, running around the arena, taking out enemies to steal their weapons to use against the boss, this is all stuff that really lets you show off the flashy movement mechanics of the game and makes you feel like an absolute fucking badass to take this thing out. Black Doom also makes for a decent fight, but honestly not that noteworthy to say he's kind of the big bad of the game. Although, to be fair, there is a different boss fight for the true ending, which obviously lives up to the expectations a bit more. Sonic and Diabolon is honestly a pretty good fight, just a little bit slow-paced. I feel like there needs to be a way to kill this guy a little bit faster, because he has a lot of HP, and it's almost impossible to ever hit this guy with a weapon, so you have to do it the slow way with homing attacks. That being said, the fight is fun, it's just maybe a little bit long-winded. As I say, in terms of boss fights, I definitely think the Egg Dealer is the worst of the bunch, just because you have to rely on extremely janky lock-on physics for the homing attack just to be able to fight this boss. And half the time I die on this boss, it's not actually because it hit me, it's because a homing attack missed its lock-on and then went flying off the stage. Not to mention, fucking half this boss is just the thing running away from you when you're trying to fight it. But I'm saving the best for last because, my god, I absolutely love the Heavy Dog and Blue Falcon fights on the evil routes of the game. I think these boss fights in the game do the most to show off the potential of this combat system if they did more to flesh it out in a theoretical follow-up game. I think one of the only problems this game sometimes has with the bosses is that a lot of them feel like they lean too hard to one way or the other, where some of them feel like you can only kill them with the homing attack and some of them feel like you can only kill them with weapons. These two fights feel like the only two bosses in the game where both are equally viable. I really like how neither of these fights ever really have any forced downtime where they just say, hold up, wait for me to do this before you're allowed to attack me again. No, these fights just let you blitz them to death with non-stop damage if you have the skill to be able to do that while not getting hit. But even then, they have much bigger health bars than the typical bosses of old from the classic Sonic games, so it's not just like you damage stun lock them and destroy them before they can even fight back. Even when you do well against these bosses, they get a chance to fight back. So with all that established and that tangent on boss fights aside, we can finally talk about my favourite aspect of this game. The choice to be a hero or a villain. I am not going to pretend this is the most original idea out there. Yo, is that a Fable reference? However, I actually think using this mechanic for Shadow's game was nothing short of a stroke of pure genius. Not even just for the story implications, although the mechanic does incidentally fit very well with Shadow's anti-hero character, but more for how it does replayability right in this game. As I said earlier, a lot of time is put into creating these 3D environments that you can blow through in seconds flat, so the game needs to get creative when it comes to finding ways to continue to feel worth playing after you blow through the game and get the ending pretty quickly considering all the dev hours they probably put into making it. Already, the multiple paths here add plenty of reason to go back and replay the game. The game's only 6 levels long, and then it's over, but if you stop there, you've barely experienced even a quarter of what the game has to offer. There's a total of 22 different levels to play through in total, and if you want to play all 22 of them, it will take a minimum of 5 playthroughs. And some, understandably, may consider this a cheap trick to extend the playtime, but I have to say, I actually feel like this doesn't just extend the playtime. It is actually the best way to play the game in my opinion, and I'm glad it was made this way. Your first time playing this game, you will guaranteed be stumbling over to the exit of each level at a painfully slow pace, getting lost everywhere and bumping into every obstacle. But after a couple more playthroughs, you'll quickly go shooting through those very same levels that gave you hell the first time round at blistering speeds. And the experience is just so different, it really hardly feels like the same level anymore. And this is where the replayability factor really gets good. Because while there are only 22 possible levels to play, there are far more missions to complete, since each stage contains 3 missions, or 2 if that stage doesn't have a neutral route, and most missions provide a very different experience to a normal playthrough of the level. As a result, this game just really scales well with however long you want to play it. Are you content enough to just finish the game and call it a day? Sure thing, a full playthrough is only 6 stages long, so you can easily finish that off in 1 day. Were you hoping for far more content? Well, hold your horses, if you try a different path, you've got another 16 whole stages to discover. There's plenty more to see if you were hoping to keep playing. Oh, you beat all 22 of those stages over 5 or more playthroughs and still want more? Well, just because you beat every single stage in the game doesn't mean you beat every mission. You've only completed about half of the game's 53 total missions at this point, not counting the true ending you can unlock for seeing all 10 of the different endings based on the decisions you've made. No matter whether you want something quick to blast through for some fun, or just a truly meaty piece of gaming content to sink your teeth into and grind on for a good while, Shadow has you covered either way. Hell, if you're a real masochist, the game's library keeps track of the exact path you took to get your endings to each playthrough. So although there's 10 endings plus a true ending in total, the library holds a total of up to 326 possible paths through the story. Anyone out there up to play through all of Shadow the Hedgehog 326 times over to get every single possible path to every single possible ending? Nope. Huh. Can't imagine why. But seriously though, this mechanic not only helps make this game so much more replayable, and honestly makes revisiting levels you've already beaten something to genuinely look forward to rather than dread the tedium of, but it also fits thematically so well with Shadow's character. Oh boy, you are going to have to bear with me for a moment here, because to be completely honest, until writing the script for this video, I actually never knew what Shadow's whole deal and backstory was. I mean, I say that, I kind of got it through cultural osmosis, but I never actually, found out the true word-for-word story until literally just now making this video. As I said, I missed the release of Sonic Adventure 2, and I was never a fan of the adventure games, and Shadow debuted in Sonic Adventure 2's story. So, as a result, you're going to have to understand that this retelling of events is based off of a quick scan of Shadow's page on the wiki, and me taking some time to watch some of the cutscenes of Sonic Adventure 2 on YouTube. So I might get some of the details a little iffy. As I understand it though, Shadow the Hedgehog was designed to be the ultimate life form. Now why the ultimate life form is a black hedgehog with rocket boots, I really don't know, and I genuinely don't know if there's ever any context given in all of Sonic canon on that, or if we're just supposed to accept that as fact. Either way, he was created by Gerald Robotnik, Eggman's grandfather and idol. He created him initially with the hopes he would be able to cure a rare and otherwise incurable disease his granddaughter Maria had. Shadow ended up befriending Maria, and she was the person he cared about more than anyone in the world. But eventually the military came to fear what he was creating and shut down his research. They captured Shadow and killed Maria, leaving Shadow and Gerald enraged. Gerald, furious that both the granddaughter and the research that he had devoted his entire life to had been taken from him, planned to launch the space colony he made Shadow on, the Ark, into the Earth to destroy the planet that had taken everything away from him. And at the end of Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic and Shadow both used the Chaos Emeralds to enter their super forms and prevent the Ark from colliding with the Earth. While Sonic makes it out of this alive, Shadow is nowhere to be seen come the credits. At least until Shadow the Hedgehog story picks up where Sonic Adventure 2 left off, with Shadow having no memory of what happened on the Ark that day, trying to rediscover who he was. If you take the neutral route, it's even revealed that Eggman has stored away hundreds of android clones of Shadow, and so I don't believe we ever get confirmation on whether Shadow really did die at the end of Sonic Adventure 2, and the Shadow we know and love today is actually only an android copy, or if it is the original Shadow who somehow survived and got amnesia. It's also revealed that the alien race invading the world in the events of the game, the Black Arms, are related to Shadow. The leader of the Black Aliens, Black Doom, gave his DNA to Gerald to create Shadow in the first place, essentially meaning he himself is half hedgehog, half Black Arms alien. So why am I telling you all this? Well, because while the awkward line delivery and the short and confusing storytelling of the game's cutscenes certainly don't sell it super well, I actually think the core concepts of the story are really strong. Oh god, I'm really doing this, aren't I? Shadow is obviously a character made to appeal to the edgy teens of the world trying to find their identity in the world. And here he is, Shadow, an edgy badass based off of a darker take on a childhood hero who quite literally lost his identity entirely and is searching to rediscover it. The parallels are quite obvious, and it's quite clear that he's made to appeal to these kind of people. And yeah, it might seem a little confusing for the sake of it at first, all this uncertainty around Shadow's past, but I think it's fully intentional actually. Shadow naively thinks that if he could just learn about his past, he could find out what his identity is or should be. But even once you finally have the full picture, Shadow's left with no more a defined identity than when he started. He initially was created for good, and he promised to do as Maria asked him with her dying words and give humanity a chance despite all they have taken from him. He took those words to heart when he put his life on the line to save the planet alongside Sonic at the end of Sonic Adventure 2. So was he a hero? Well, he may have loved Maria, and his creator may have began with good intentions, but Gerald eventually turned and wanted to see the whole world burn and suffer for what they did to him. If Shadow truly believes that his past defines his identity and it's extremely important to him, doesn't that mean he should carry out Gerald, his creator's final wish, and destroy the Earth as punishment for all the wrong mankind has done? Not to mention, the very being whose DNA makes him the ultimate life form, Black Doom, is aligned with Gerald's goals. Black Doom also wants to see humanity suffer for all the evil they commit. If Shadow truly does care so much about his past and his legacy, and believes it to be integral to his identity, shouldn't he be the villain? Or perhaps does he simply just not take orders from anyone? I mean, that sounds about right at first. Is he just happy being himself? He'd certainly like to think that, but for someone who doesn't take orders from anyone, he does seem very wrapped up in his past and his creators, allowing them to dictate his path in life rather than forging it for himself. It's kind of telling that the neutral route is all about Shadow seemingly not caring about good or evil, only caring about going his own way, not taking orders from anyone. And yet the entire focus of it is having Shadow chase down Eggman of all people to get answers from him, to find out who he is by asking someone else entirely, who never even knew him all that well. I think it's also fitting that the neutral route is where Shadow finds the Shadow androids. On one hand, he's insulted by and terrified at the notion he might just be a pale imitation of the real Shadow, who's already been dead for a good while. But on the other hand, it's kind of freeing, isn't it? Knowing that after all the importance he put on his past, letting it control him, it might not have ever even been his past in the first place. He might not have a past. He may be truly free to create his own path in life. And yet, he still lets his past control him. It really puts the game's theme song, I Am All of Me, into perspective. When I first heard it, I thought it was just a bit of an awkward way of getting across that sort of badass, macho, self-confident vibe they clearly desperately wanted Shadow to give off. And clearly that is part of it. But in hindsight, it really is a phrase that encapsulated the entire point of the game's story. Shadow is a hero to some extent. He's undeniably done heroic things in his life and must have an inkling of a good heart to have ever cared for Maria. But that's only a part of him. Shadow is a villain to some extent too, acting as an antagonist to Sonic and showing at best callous disregard and at worst contempt for other people's hopes and worries. But that's only a part of him. You can't call Shadow a hero, but you can't call him a villain either. And even if he may be an android, he also clearly can't be dismissed as just a pale imitation. Since he's clearly set himself apart from his android brethren, the other androids seemingly have no personality or free will of their own, but it's clear to see that the Shadow we see today can think for himself and has his own personality unlike the rest of the androids. He is all of himself. Friendly reminder, we're currently talking about Shadow the Hedgehog for the PlayStation 2. Okay, listen, the story of this game is not amazing, as you'd expect. But it's not really that it has bad ideas is my point, it's more bad execution. The actual overarching concepts and themes surrounding the narrative, I actually think are quite compelling. I have to say, they all fit together perfectly for a story about Shadow. The only problem is, while I can see this impressive vision the developers had for this game, no doubt, for its story, from a zoomed out big picture perspective, when I actually zoom in and see what the moment-to-moment character interactions and storytelling looks like...
This makes... 5 Chaos Emeralds.
What's up, Shadow?
Not you again.
Nice to see you too. Looks like those black creatures are headed out to space. We're on our way to the Ark, so I guess that means we're going too.
Ark.
Come on, let's roll. Next stop, the Ark.
Yeesh, yep. That's a Sonic game, alright. So to answer the question I asked much earlier, whether this game is kind of cringe but proud in the way the comics are, kind of? It certainly doesn't stick the landing as smoothly, but I can't lie. I do like the vibe of this game. Yes, it's stupidly over the top and edgy, but to be honest, I only ever got the vibe it was doing so in a cringy way in 1 or 2 cutscenes, and even then, whenever it did, Let's be real, it was fucking hilarious. I know everyone's seen the "where's that damn 4th Chaos Emerald" clip, but there are a couple other lesser known ones that got me cackling to myself to death. I never hear anyone bring up this one, so maybe this is just me, but I can't lie, I find this one hilarious. One of my personal favorites and more subtle ones is when Shadow feels the need to stop and clarify to the audience his moral stance on pilfering confectionery from small defenseless infants.
A Chaos Emerald? You've got to be kidding me, guys. This is like taking candy from a baby, which is fine by me.
The best one, though, has to be the quote that Shadow says for beating the first level.
Disgusting black creatures, get out of my sight.
That's for the hero mission.
Perfect.
Either way, honestly, that was kind of the worst of it. I always got the vibe this game was the way it was because, well, the entire vibe of the game is supposed to reflect Shadow's outlook and mindset. Not necessarily condone it or pretend he's right, which, hang on a minute, isn't that just like the comics? Where the dystopian and depressing tone is contrasted by a surprisingly upbeat and optimistic narrative because that reflects on the personality of the comic's own main character, Sonic. Here, in Shadow the Hedgehog, the game has an edgy, try-hard tone to it because that's how Shadow sees himself. That's his own outlook being reflected by the game, since the game is about him. But the game doesn't really seem to pretend that Shadow is right. Wasn't I just mentioning earlier how over the course of the story, Shadow, in trying to be defiant and independent, is ironically letting his creators control who he is by defining himself by his past rather than his present? If Shadow chooses to be a villain, then in trying to act vengeful and defiant, he's ironically turning himself into a servile lackey, just for another greater evil, Black Doom. And if Shadow chooses to be neutral, he spends the entire time an alien invasion is ravaging the planet, just chasing down Eggman to find out what his past was. And after all that, in the end, he not only discovers he hardly had a past to speak of, but that he may not have even been the person he thought he was, and if he isn't, then he genuinely has no past to speak of after all that effort. Shadow only really gets a happy ending by choosing to be a hero and do the right thing of his own volition, despite the grudge he holds against Sonic, and the uneasy alliances that he has with the series as villains. I definitely do think Shadow the Hedgehog could have been every bit as cringy as it looks from the outside if it was written as if Shadow was right. If it was treated as if the dark route was the correct one, and that Shadow would be justified in killing humanity, and would be happier for having done it. They easily could have done that if they just wanted to cash in on the edgy teenager market, but they showed some self-awareness and restraint. It's fun to be the ambivalent, edgy anti-hero for a bit, and really get into his head to understand his mindset, but I never really got the feeling the overall message of this game strayed from the heroic optimism and hope that the Sonic games are known for. It just gave you a bit of an opportunity to play around a little bit on the dark side, just to see what it was like. So while certainly I still think the comics handle it better, I do feel overall that Shadow the Hedgehog is cringe but proud. That it shows the sincerity it needs to make its own story mean something and being worthy of being cared about, but also that it demonstrates just enough self-awareness in the way it's written that it doesn't really feel embarrassing to watch for me. I have to hold my disbelief a little, yes. I have to hold my tongue a little and hear the game out when I think it's going somewhere stupid, yes. And occasionally, it does make me burst out loud laughing at it.
You must keep your nation strong and together.
Yes, keep the nation united. No matter what happens, we'll never surrender to these creatures. This much I learned from them.
But, all that said, yeah, I do thoroughly enjoy this game and its story. Once again, just another friendly reminder. Shadman the Edgelord. Just a reminder.